have a new laptop, so I'm like, I don't have everything set up here. Here we go. I have a background now.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah, sweet background. Heck yeah. Well, that looks like Rhino in the background too.
Yeah, just a quick grasshopper.
Yeah, it looks like a grasshopper. Do you still do grasshopper?
Yeah, sure do. Yeah.
Heck
Rhino,
yeah.
Rabbit, the whole gamut.
Well, because
Adobe Creative Cloud.
and I guess I'm just jumping into it here now
Yeah,
too. I'm so bad at
sure.
intros and things too. It's like
No worries.
it get awkward. But because I mean,
Sure.
you're doing so much AI, at least what I see on social media these days. But you still do grasshopper and Rhino.
Oh yeah, totally.
Heck yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
I mean, how much do you think AI has driven into like your even like academic work these days or so?
That's a great question. I mean, to me, it's not really replacing a lot. It's more of like augmenting certain things or connecting with certain things. So, for instance, I might just be using AI, Gen AI to render things out, maybe even in real time while I'm modeling or something like that. I've never been great at that sort of end of things, like sort of playing around with all the settings and render engines. So being able to describe what I want in natural language is actually kind of helpful for me in that case. I'm doing a lot more sort of getting under the hood, whereas before I was kind of limited in how much Python or C Sharp or VB script I could write. Now I can sort of vibe code some things or take old stuff and have large language models sort of check it and debug it for me if it's not working anymore. So it's a lot of little things here and there. It's not necessarily replacing my my need to sort of like model geometry and think about space, composition, form, and order, those sorts of things. Um, that said, I actually do an exercise every day where usually when I wake up, where I just, take an idea, run with it on a Gen AI model like Midjourney, and I just post the results on social media. So I try to do that on a daily basis. I find that no matter what I have in my head, it gives me something that's a bit of a surprise. It always gives you what you ask for, but not necessarily what you wanted. And I kind of understand that as a key difference from all the other digital tools I use. And so I kind of value that in a way that I don't find that frustrating. I find that more in the way of having a critic or somebody like a devil's advocate sort of taking my ideas and subverting maybe my preconceptions about them. So it's like kind of like getting a desk crit every morning when I wake up and I have an idea and I just sort of throw it at one of these models.
Or I guess you realize like the words you are actually saying to describe something, what's in your head and how it interprets it, or maybe how others can interpret it, it could be
Yeah.
different. Or so
Two
too.
separate things, right? And that's the question, right? If it doesn't think like us, then how do we use that to our advantage? How do we make that a feature, not a bug, right? So I think that's one of the big questions out about generative AI right now, these diffusion models. But like I said, I found lots of uses for them. I mean, yeah, it's even the mundane things like writing recommendation letters. I can feed ChatGPT, for instance, like 8 different letters I've written in the past, and sort of say restructure some of these, and then of course I always sort of rewrite and make some of them very specific to the person I'm writing them for. But it's actually a big help. It sort of gets some of the grunt work out of the way. Some of the times when I'd have writer's block or designer's block, I find these tools are kind of helpful to sort of get the wheels in my head spinning again in the right direction. They just sort of tease your imagination in I think really helpful ways. Even if you don't rely on them for, let's say, final results of anything, they can I think they can be very helpful in that sort of process-based brainstorming, scenario planning, the part of the design process or the part of any kind of process, the creative process, where you're thinking divergently, right? You're like trying to come up with all kinds of ideas. Later on, you'll sort of look at them later with a more critical eye and sort of decide what moves forward. But So
What
yeah, and then getting my students to use them too is kind of an interesting thing, as well. I mean, they're kind of skeptical of it, but then they kind of enjoy rendering things out really quickly, as they're modeling again. Um,
and in
and
Rhino,
more, I
is there a
think most of their
tool?
tools like Photoshop,
Mhm.
it's hard to use any tools in Photoshop these days that haven't been sort of tweaked through machine learning, even selecting the background or a midground or finding the subject of a photo and moving things around, removing things, adding things. There are neural filters, upscaling just to get, to actually add resolution in detail now. That was something that's like the holy grail, right? I
Mhm.
remember ever since, teaching students about Photoshop and photo manipulation, raster graphics, it's like you can't add information. Now you
Right.
can,
And
and kind
also,
of
like,
interesting.
even removing a background, like, is that work you want to do? Like, what are you really
Yeah.
learning by lassoing out an object or something? It's like,
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. So getting rid of some of those mundane things, getting rid of power lines or in a
right.
photo that you took of the site or changing the sky even. I mean, it's kind of weird some of the things you can do. And then the sort of uncanny valley that results sometimes.
And
Um,
Rhino, like, when you mentioned that, like, you'll be doing modeling and then be doing like a generative AI to help you with the render on that. What tools
sure.
do you use for that? Because you also mentioned some custom code on top of that, or
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of models at your disposal if you're interested in that stuff. But for the long time, you've been able to, uh, in this case, I use Comfy UI,
oh, nice.
and then
Okay.
I download some base models, let's say Stable Diffusion, like SDXL or SD 3.5. Or there's some newer ones out that are actually quite nice. What are they called? I can't
Is it like
remember them offhand.
Flux?
Flux, yeah,
Have I
Flux is
seen that?
great. Flux is great. It's interesting because that one actually seems to have some temporal coherence. It sort of really reads the scene, I think, really well, and then um, can recreate it, but at different, from different vantage points. So,
Oh, well, that
but
is
anyway,
next
again, you
level.
can run things with canny edges, control net, or depth mapping, and then start to re-render things with some images. And now, even Midjourney has retexturing with using control, some sort of version of control net. So there's a variety of ways to do these things, and then of course you can quickly animate them as well. So I found that I don't get anything. Well, let me just say that bridging between 2D and 3D assets or outputs is, I think, the next sort of holy grail, and I don't think we're there yet. There are diffusion models that try to generate point clouds. Then there are some that models that will try to read the image and then do the reverse, sort of read the depth from the image, and then try to give you something based off of a depth map. Um, and those are started working. Those are starting to get a little better as they progress, as they mature. But again, what's interesting is that, we have tools like photogrammetry, Gaussian splatting, this idea that if I can take a scene and then animate it, if there's coherence in what it's sort of showing as I move around, let's say move around an object, a virtual object in the round, then theoretically I could take that object or that video and try to do some photogrammetry with it. So, there's lots of different interesting technologies out there. And of course,
Wait,
I mentioned Gaussian splatting. That's just
mhm.
sort of taking the photogrammetry that much further and trying to sort of use generative AI to plug holes and begin to generate more immersive environments around these things. So
Did you mention that you're doing it's generative AI to then video, and then you feed that into a photogrammetry to then get a mesh of it?
you can try, and oftentimes what I found is that it doesn't really work so well, right? So when it's generating video, it doesn't generate. Let's say I'm spinning around an environment. Um, it doesn't really create things and maintain the proportions needed for a really clean photogrammetry sort of reading, where you can stitch together something. But there are tools that are starting to facilitate that process more and more using generative AI. So again,
Mhm.
we used to call them neural radiance fields. Now there's
Nerfs.
I think even more, yeah, nerfs, even more promising Gaussian splatting, just ways of sort of, again, going from that 2D to 3D and sort of thinking about, it's always been a classic problem with point cloud making and sort of scanning, laser scanning, is that there's shadows behind things, right? So
Right.
and so Gaussian splatting is again another way of sort of thinking about how do you clean those things up, optimize a point cloud and get rid of all the sort of noise, but also to start filling in holes and starting to fill in behind shadows.
But a
So
Gaussian splat is, as far as I'm familiar with it, it's not a mesh. And so is there a step to go from a splat to mesh, or do you just live in the
yeah,
splat world? When you're in
that's a
splat
great
land, you
question. At
stay
a
there.
certain point, it's like the law of diminishing returns, right? You have to have so much computing power. You don't have it on a laptop. I'm not sure, but I suspect if you can get points and you can get color data on points, you can somehow generate a mesh at some point.
I guess I'll use that as
And
like a
then
vertice
there's
or
the question
something
of,
and connect
how
them.
useful is a mesh, right? Or a point cloud,
Hmm.
right? Like, to me, I think that's how much fidelity do you need in the information? Let's say I'm trying to describe a surface. Maybe I want to actually describe it as a surface, not or as a plane, not as a set of points with color values. So, again, all of these tools have their trade-offs.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And
But
sometimes I get stuck on things because, like, I've just been dealing with meshes for so long,
yeah,
especially in visualization, where then to me, it's like everything must go to mesh. But that's a good thing.
yeah,
Does it
exactly
need
right.
to? Maybe
Yeah,
not. That's
yeah,
okay.
sure.
It's like, it's only if that mesh, if the output you have needs a mesh. Otherwise, yeah, it
Yeah.
depends on your medium or like whatever you're trying to output to. And I've seen some cool things lately too, because um, I've heard from other artists as well and other even like studio owners that are using like Meshy.ai to do that photo to 3D for a
Uh-huh.
mesh. And then
Yeah.
they're just using those in small areas. Like it was actually on the first episode of this podcast too.
Uh-huh.
Nate was mentioning how they did it because they had an interior designer that had like unique artifacts for a project, and they were doing
Uh-huh.
like marketing renders for some penthouse, and they were like, we're not going to model these, so they did the image to 3D for that, but they're definitely not
Yeah.
doing the full scene yet. It's
Right.
just these little elements. And I've seen the latest research papers I've been kind of reading on that is the idea that you kind of say you have say you want to recreate a scene, you would take a photo of the scene, and then you take every object in there and you run those individually into their own like photo to mesh, and then you
Oh, interesting.
recombine the scene with the multiple objects. So everything's not
Hmm.
just one mesh. You can still have hundreds or thousands of objects in the scene that can then be manipulated, but you kind of like isolated each one and had those
Right.
generated
Right.
to
I
go
mean,
in.
all of this is to say, I mean, I think we're saying the same thing, is that there's no like magic button that just sort of like does all of this work for us still. That's still reliant on human discernment, and then some transformative human labor in order to sort of make these things really useful. And so I think that's again a sort of interesting spot that we're in that we're starting to see the capacities tools to help us do some of the things that we want to do. But there again, we've only really seemed to scratch the surface. They're really starting to make, I think, some really interesting. Well, I guess the question I guess that brings up to me is like at what point can we just sort of say, look, all the workflows I can think of, the machine can do them for us. I don't know if we'll ever get there, right? In other words, I wonder, if we're not really necessarily replacing human labor in a lot of these workflows, but we're shifting what the human does and what we offload to the machine. And
Hmm.
again, I think if we think of it that way, then I think that's a really interesting way of sort of approaching, well, what do I need to learn? What kind of skills are not going to be displaced or replaced 10 years from now. And it starts to open up, I think, an interesting can of worms and sort of making you ask yourself, what's innately human? What can't be automated, or at least not automated anytime soon? So these qualities of critical thinking, ethics, empathy, and taste,
And even the
and situational
creativity.
awareness, cultural
Hmm.
awareness.
Right? Sure.
These sorts of things aren't necessarily easily um, even if we could find ways to try to automate them, I think we still sort of understand the limits of the machine to do this stuff. And that's where I kind of see these things happening. Maybe we don't have to work as hard or as long, but ultimately, we're still responsible for sort of scaffolding problems,
Right.
weighing the sort of pros and cons, the trade-offs involved, making the decisions, and then relaying those back to a machine to then execute certain things. And then, so it's a fascinating time,
And
and I think it goes to, but certainly I would say that's me being hopeful, and that these technologies don't just allow the most powerful to sort of just again replace human labor with machine labor and leave us the rest of us behind.
but I
So
guess that's even like, that's the whole like industrial revolution, created more jobs, we automated things, creates
yeah,
more, that kind of argument. And, even back to your background, using like a grasshopper rhino, you can tell that's even like raycast rendered too. It's like that's the old school approach. And,
yeah,
even starting this, I'm glad you have that back there because that's what you taught me,
yeah,
back
yeah, a
maybe
long,
like
long time
in like
ago.
2012 now or so. And that was the
Yeah,
workflow. And like, so sometimes even AI can scare me because it's like, hey, I know this workflow so well. This is what I was trained on. I went to university for this. And now to, have it change, if we went full generative, that would just be like, no, because
right.
I spent so long learning that and all. But even that grasshopper script, even back in 2012, I mean, try doing that by hand every time. Like the whole idea of
Yeah,
parametric design,
right.
you can't, if you were to do that by hand, it would take you forever. Then you make one change and you go
Yeah,
recalculate everything.
and
No,
that's
use a
the
computer.
question. I think that's the biggest question, right? I think as creatives try to come to creative terms with any technology, right? They sort of see it, is it a tool, is it a medium, or is it sort of blur both? But eventually you start to understand that maybe, a specific technology has a particular set of biases, strengths and weaknesses, affordances,
Right.
right? And
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 then
then it
you need to
begins
be
to
creative.
maybe evolve some of the things that you actually do with it. And so, you would do something different with photography than you would do with painting, for
Right.
instance, right?
Totally.
And
Absolutely.
so that becomes the question then is what can we do with Gen AI, for instance, as a medium, right?
Hmm.
And what kind of affordances does it open up? Now, of course, one of its main affordances you can automatically sort of see is the speed,
Right.
right? So now I can render something. I mean, it looks like I rendered it and then post-produced it in Photoshop, and it
Right.
does it in
Hmm.
30 seconds,
And it looks
right?
like you have 20 years of experience doing
But
that.
but
you know?
but I would also argue that that I think one of the more important parts here, and it's I came across this when I was experimenting. I'm a creative partner for Runway ML. They do
Oh,
diffusion video, right? And
sure.
so
Yeah.
I can just run it for free all the time.
Wow.
So
That's a pretty
But
good
what
deal.
I really understood after a while is playing around with it is I really suck at storytelling with video media, right? So having access to the tools didn't necessarily like make me good at storytelling, right? And so, to me, I think that, again, that's another sort of way of thinking about this. If I'm not spending as much time on the production, then that gives me more time to really, really, really fine tune and think about and maybe generate all kinds of different scenarios when it comes to storytelling or whatever the sort of the specifics of the project are.
Right. And
But
really, the
again,
storytelling is the most deepest creative part, maybe, of video making as well, too, you can
right,
say. And that's still
right.
left to the human.
So you can throw technology at things, but if there's not something that connects with other humans, right?
Yeah. It's
Like
just,
storytelling,
yeah. Right.
world building, whatever you
Hmm.
want to call it,
Hmm.
right? Then I think again the technology can be useful or it can be a crutch, right?
Right.
And I think that's the question. How do
Mhm.
we come to creative terms with it? Means how do we find these things to actually be genuinely useful for the things we want to do
Or
with
like,
them?
I'm sure you've heard the term AI slop.
Yeah, 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 of course.
And why is that even a term? But what makes it slop? It's
Right.
the same, it's using the same model that great images maybe came from, or great video, or whatever it is, but it was that creative act. It was, the thing that you generated, we call it slop because it
Yeah.
has no meaning or it has no creativity to it or something like that. And it's like,
Yeah,
well, the
exactly.
fact that that term exists just proves that there's a human element behind it that's driving this generative.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's really interesting. But on the other hand, I will say this, right? Like I have the benefit of being like a researcher and academic. And so not being sort of immersed in the real world, trying to do real projects with this stuff sometimes. Sometimes I do, but from an academic side of things, I'm actually kind of interested in the slop. I'm kind of interested in sort of saying, well, how did the model work and how, if it generates uncanny things, why? Or what happened here, right? Like I'm really kind of genuinely interested in sort of understanding how a machine understands our world just based on its training data too, right? So this idea, I think of or sorry, AI slop, right? I think is again, of course, right? Like you're gonna see the good, the bad, and the ugly. Um, and I see it all the time when it comes to sketching. I see it all the time when it comes to form making and Rhino or something, right? And I see
Sure.
it all the time with AI tools too. But at a certain point, I sort of also think about, well, what if there is a sort of post-humanist sort of vantage point from this, right? Like, what if there are more forms of intelligence than just human intelligence? Right? What if the machines could actually generate things that they actually enjoy and not focus on things that humans might enjoy, right? I don't think we're there yet, but it
Hmm.
gets to these questions of, if we do actually create something like a real artificial intelligence, like a general intelligence, a
Right. Yeah,
super
the true
intelligence,
AGI. Yeah, the super
right?
AGI.
Then then the question is, well, what would we do with it, and would it even care about us? You know what I mean? It's kind of
Sure.
an interesting question.
Hmm.
This idea of how much agency would we give it to actually make any kind of real decisions for us,
Hmm.
or to control systems for us, right? And so I think it's a really interesting thing, but you're starting to see, I think. Um, I did come across somebody really interesting. I was giving a talk in in the UAE in Abu Dhabi of all places, and I met this guy. He spoke a couple of couple turns ahead of me, and I was in the audience at the time. And he runs a lab called, I forget what it's called. Something has to do with giving machines consciousness, machine
Oh,
consciousness.
okay.
And so
Sounds
I was
safe.
thinking, what a pipe dream. I
Yeah.
looked at the lab. I looked at the name of this and the talk, and I'm like, it was really fascinating to me. Their position isn't like, we can make machines with consciousness. I think their real position was, is it possible to make machines with a consciousness? And and maybe we should be asking that question if we really want to have an artificial intelligence that can navigate a world with us and navigate a world with ethics and morals, with rights and wrongs. Then surely we need to sort of think about, well, um, is human consciousness able to be transported from a brain into, non-biological silicon-based intelligence, or can silicon-based intelligence, non-biological intelligence actually develop consciousness? And they're looking at all kinds of interesting sort of ways of thinking, research projects, funding research projects on human consciousness to better understand human consciousness in order to sort of understand, could that be replicated or
Hmm.
generated in some way? It's a
Or
really kind of fascinating
how about this?
question. We have lots of debates with my
Mhm.
students and I about these sorts of things when we do readings and then discuss these things. I
But
think it's kind of interesting to sort of for a moment at least take a stance on one of these things
well,
and
I've
really
got
sort
a
of think
question
things
for you
through.
then.
Yeah, yeah,
This
yeah,
this just popped in, and because with human consciousness, I would argue there's no correct person on anything,
yeah.
and we're always right and we're always wrong on certain things, and it's actually through the act
Right,
of communicating. In like even us talking right now, we don't have any answers to certain things, so we have to communicate, we have to talk, so we have to take both of our consciousnesses and like
yeah,
overlap in ways and ask questions and communicate there. But if you have a
right.
super AGI, and then you'll last point I'll make on us,
Hmm.
networking each other is when it comes to diversity, because that is good. You want a diversity of opinions and ideas so then we can
Hmm.
find like this middle ground. But
Right.
if we say that there's this AGI, this super AGI, where's the diversity and who says that that's right? So it's like, is that maybe just a flawed idea in general? Like, do we actually want that?
No,
maybe.
yeah, exactly right. I think a very valid both question and concern, right? Because, ultimately, I think what we're seeing with Gen AI is, another term I'll throw out, just like AI slop, tech bros, right?
Sure.
And they're very, without any humility at all, they're very good at overpromising, and they're just constant hype machines. And the
Hmm.
reason why is because they're trying to raise the next $1 billion for the next model, right? Or whatever it is.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
trying to raise the vast sums of money. And at a certain point in time, I think people start to resent that big time, right? This idea that somebody who's a billionaire is telling us that we need to invest all of our resources into this next model, right? Or
That they're
whatever it
going to
is.
own. And it's
But
like, oh,
but for
okay. Yeah,
sure, I mean,
right.
we already see the limits of these things. They're not perfect, right? They try to please us. They sometimes are overconfident in the wrong answers that they give us. And so really, I think what we understand is that, and I think what they're trying to understand is, are we really just uh, are our brains, our consciousness really just sort of evaluating the pros and cons, or weighting a series of trade-offs in a decision-making tree? And if so, that's not a perfect process. It certainly wouldn't be perfect if you could automate that with a machine,
Right.
with artificial intelligence. But think about a branching decision-making tree that is exponentially larger, and deeper than what a human brain could accomplish. It still sort of goes back to, well, what's right or wrong, and how do you decide what's right or wrong, right? And so again, I feel like this is the really fascinating thing, right? Um, to me, I feel like the world really needs a strong liberal arts education, right? Like they need to sort of talk about things like ethical frameworks. They need to talk about what does it mean, for economics and labor. They need to start questioning what is really creativity, right?
Right.
Those sorts of things. And universities are probably one of the most unique places in the world that have a collection of people that could actually talk about
Mhm.
these things and provide some of the tools for these conversations that we need to have as a
That's right.
society.
And it's
But
okay to
we're probably
learn
these,
how to
but we're
sing.
also these really huge and slow institutions that
Mm.
aren't very good at pivoting and responding to the moment.
Sure.
It's
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
so frustrating
But also, like,
because,
where else do you learn how to sing? And then an hour later, you can learn pottery, and then you can go
right,
learn history, and
right,
that you don't do that in the workplace. That's for
right. Yeah, you
sure.
don't you don't
Like,
have conversations, in a seminar setting about Plato, and then go and take a test on advanced mathematics or something. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Where
exactly.
if there is a super AGI that can, know history really well or something, or, can operate systems really well or something. Like I heard something recently, where it's like if all of air traffic control can just like be done by an AI. And it's like, yeah, there's no art there though. There's no culture tied to that.
But even with that, right? Like, what's right or wrong, right? Like, you come back to that trolley problem, right?
Sure.
Do you save the one young person or the five old people, right? And
Right.
so what's right or wrong, I think is, I'm not sure. I don't think humans are ready to relegate that to machines,
Mm-mm. Especially not a
right? That's
machine
why I
that's
think people don't
overconfident.
like
Yeah.
self-driving cars yet. They're kind of scared of them.
Sure.
Even if you've taken a Waymo, like you can take a taxi that's self-driving.
Right.
But but at the same time, because I think humans still really grasp with these issues, right? And so, what's right or wrong can, again, like you said, vary between person to person. So then it becomes a question of who makes that decision. If a machine makes that decision, well, is it the programmer's ethical framework that
Right.
that then is
Mhm.
the bias there in the system? So,
That's right.
it's these sorts of things I think are
Hmm.
kind of fascinating.
Hmm.
But really, I mean, ultimately, these things have a way. These all of these technologies have a way of sort of making us look in the mirror at ourselves
Right.
and seeing ourselves differently,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Robotics was all about how the brain works, but also how our human body works, and kinesthetics, and how we move. And then you make bipedal robots. You have to sort of say, well, how do humans do it
Right.
really efficiently, right?
Hmm.
And AI is the same way. Now we're really starting to sort of think, well, if we want to make humans do, or sorry, machines to do something similar things to the way our brains work, then how do brains work, right? And so we start asking these questions. Ultimately, originally, I guess I should say, originally AI, when it was coined and talked about for a long time, it was thought that you just sort of pump lots of knowledge into a machine and then it just sort of spits out answers. It's a big search thing.
But is that
And
not, I would
it
still,
didn't work. It
okay.
didn't work at all. It was colossal failure. It
Mm.
was a dead field. And it wasn't until the 80s when George Hinton and some others sort of came up with the idea that we actually need to make machines learn, right? So it went from a
Oh, I
knowledge
see.
system
Right.
to a system that learns. And then back then it was still for, it was an interesting sort of discussion that they had and discourse with papers and research. But two things they didn't have at the time, enough computational power to do it, and then enough data that's collected and well structured to actually use for training, to actually learn
And we
from.
just so happened this time to have the internet. It's like,
And
how
then
about
and then
that?
in the
Yeah.
2020s, right, is that's when all of these things were together, put together enough. And now George Hinton just last year won the Nobel Prize
Mm.
on stuff that he was formulating back in the 80s and 90s,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
So
mhm. I also find it
it's kind of
interesting
interesting.
that the movies back then, like Terminator, I was rewatching Terminator 2 recently,
Uh-huh.
and like he says it right out. He goes like, "I'm a cybernetic. My computer." He calls it a CPU, so it wasn't a GPU, but I get that.
Yeah,
But it's like
yeah.
my CPU is a neural net like operating system or something. Then he goes like a learning computer, and it's like
Yeah,
that was in the 80s though too. But even watching
yeah.
those movies growing up, I never heard that line. I never figured that
Right.
out or so. But then it was like, wow, these ideas really have been in our culture for a very
But
long time.
now, I mean, if you can't really do much in the fields that we do, when you're pushing technology, you hear neural networks all the time,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
You know, it's a, it's in the public lexicon now,
Yeah,
right?
that's
It's
right. And I think for me, it was because I even saw maybe in like 2016, 2017, I knew some people in Los Angeles that were doing like generative images and like AI art. And
yeah,
they claim to be like some of the first ones that are like selling AI art. And they're trying to print them on large canvases, sell them for buku dollars and whatnot.
right.
But they were abstract. They were
Yeah.
they were like
Oh
paint
yeah. Oh yeah.
splatters almost,
Uh,
and then it
I
was
mean, and it's really interesting to sort of see how these things, even in the last 5 years, have moved, right? Like
right.
we went
Hmm.
from like the GANs, the generative adversarial networks, right?
Right.
So the idea there was to have a generator and then a discriminator, right? So you would have something, it's like an arms race. You would have an algorithm trying to generate stuff better and better. And you have something telling that generator it's not good enough,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And so that was it, but they sort of met a ceiling with that. And then suddenly they figured out the latent diffusion models. So that diffusion from Gaussian noise was just like
Is that
groundbreaking. It
what
works so
happened?
much better and actually
Mhm.
quicker and with less energy somehow and easier to train. But then those networks, they started to say, well, maybe the models could get better if they just got bigger, just pump more and more data in.
Right. The brute force method.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that was actually until like what, just sometime last year, everybody thought that the bigger
Right.
the better, right? Eventually, if we just pump enough data in, maybe we'll hit AGI that way.
Hmm.
And then that team, the DeepSeek team from China, just showed how you could basically catch up in a matter of months with inferior hardware, and then distilling the model so that it runs like for pennies on the dollar compared to an open source model like Facebook's or Meta's, right? I mean, that was the interesting thing is that shots fired across. What that really affected was Meta's open source model,
They're
right?
like llamas. Is that what they're?
Yeah, exactly, because they're trying to do it open source. Now you
Mhm.
can do an open source model like DeepSeek for again, pennies on the dollar. And to run it for pennies on the dollar, I think that was an interesting time. It sort of turned everything on its head.
But that's also what
Um,
kind of scares me, though, too, is like, I even think just back in 2016, it was paint splatters. And
uh-huh,
now,
yeah,
what we have, and even with with DeepSeek, it just drops out of nowhere, too. It's like, who are these people? Where did these people even come? Who's the DeepSeek
yeah,
team?
yeah, yeah,
It's like, never
yeah,
heard these
yeah.
names before.
Right.
All of a sudden, they just came in and they're, going against something like Facebook and
Even
Zuckerberg. And it's like,
2022, that was
whoa.
kind of the way it was, right? I mean, you had something like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion come out, and then suddenly Adobe goes, uh-oh.
Right. Hmm.
Right? Adobe,
Hmm.
Adobe had been, doing things for years with machine learning,
Right.
but they didn't really make it available to you except maybe on like a third-party website where you can upload your images, it'll try to clip out the background for you,
Sure.
which I think is really interesting to create a crowdsource your machine learning algorithm. But you know, this idea then that suddenly, uh-oh, here comes Google now, and here comes Meta, and here comes Apple later even,
Right.
and Adobe, and you know, in the building industry, Autodesk is now grappling with these things,
Sure.
trying to sort of make some useful things. But there's a lot of third-party startups that are doing some interesting things as well. George Guida has what's the name of that? Oh, Xform, I think, or something.
I'm
I can.
actually not too familiar. I can maybe
Yeah, there's
do a
a
quick
couple of
search.
apps, and you know, maybe if this finds a home on YouTube or something, we can always maybe send some links or something in the comments. But
I could do that, and I can
yeah,
even do an edit or
Ex
so.
Figura by George Guida is a great one. There's a nice one done by Carlos Banyan, where it lets you sort of gives you a sort of paint canvas, and you can start to draw digitally, and then it's in real time. It's sort of updating with the diffusion model, latent diffusion model, rendering things based on a prompt you give it, natural language. That's let's see, I can't remember that one either, but there's lots of really interesting startups happening in the building industry space, and some that we've heard, right? Like, I mean, Hypar, Test Fit. What's the one that wants to do floor plans? Yeah,
There's a lot of
there's
them.
so many
I
out
agree.
there. It's just
Yeah,
like
there's a
my
lot.
brain goes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Same. And it's like, yeah, it's so fast. Actually, one question I had, um, I kind of asked this on the last episode, but I think you're also a great person to ask this too as well. And
Yeah,
it's if, because as in architecture, if we are able to take from our brain ideas and then generate them very quickly, right now there's like a lot of the rendering, but say
yeah,
Autodesk does train some model where they can do construction documents very easily, and it's to code and it's safe, and it even does the structure in it. And so like you're able to go from idea to construction document very quickly. Then I asked like, well, how do we build these spaces? Like what about the building
yeah.
part of that? And
Uh-huh.
would we have to get back to building things if it's so easy to generate things? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because, you know, I think it asks, first of all, it puts the question back on us as a profession, right? So in an industry, we need to sort of ask ourselves, if we wanted to try to be in any way proactive and join the fray here, we need to ask ourselves, what kinds of things do we want the machines, what kinds of things do we want to offload to the machines, right? And what kinds of things do we do in the day-to-day that we don't want to do or don't mind giving up some control, right? Now, I have some colleagues that would just love to sort of say, here's the conceptual massing, you know, here's the you know, some partie diagrams of how this thing should work, how the floor plates might line up, how to arrange core and circulation, you know, and what happens, you know, in a sort of partie section, what happens to the ground versus what happens above, whatever, right? And then say, you know, something that can generate a set of documents without errors,
Right.
right?
hmm
Um, and at the same time, I have colleagues that say, actually, most of the designing I do is at the detail level,
hmm
right? So I'm gonna maybe go, and if I have a CMU wall, I'm gonna go in that spec book and start to talk about, like, you know, how to make that perfectly imperfect and take advantage of shadows, or how to rake certain joints to, you know, again, to, you know, or whatever it is to, or you know, I know a lot of my colleagues that, you know, I had one really good one that was doing design build here, and you know, he spent a lot of time, again, with the sort of detailing on the detailing side. And that's something he would not want to give up control of, because he feels that, you know, that's something that he values. It's not necessarily just about form, but really sort of doing things poetically with how certain materials come together, and how you work those out
Right.
in the
That's like
details.
his
So
art.
in that case, right, you know,
hmm
the question is, you know, again, perhaps our tools don't need to be one size fits all.
Hmm.
For instance, right now, if I want to do a diffusion model, I have my choice of this, that, or the other, but it's the same diffusion model that everybody else is using. I can get under the hood and, maybe fine tune or train a LoRa model or something like that to use to sort of, be specific and sort of customize things a little
Sure.
further.
But you also don't
But
have a $200 billion of data that you're
yeah,
jamming into it
yeah,
too.
but I don't have a digital assistant that's actually watching me as I go to my day-to-day business and then starts to learn and understand how it can actually augment things I do or
Hmm.
do some of the things before I even know I need them done,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's both the intriguing part about maybe this idea of having AI agents, um, and also the sort of the flip side of that coin, which is how much data do you want these things collecting, and where is this stored, and who owns it, and everything else. And so again, we want a truly useful, sort of tailored AI agents to sort of help us, for sure. Then we get into questions of privacy and
Right.
and security, that
Well,
that come with those, again, with the having systems like that.
that
So
just reminds me to like just early like CPU computing, like, first generation computers, say, I'm going to call them. And as far as I know, that it started with mainframes, and it started with, one, like a few terminals that can tie into that computer. And so that's kind of like what we're doing now, but we're just doing it through the internet and a cloud where, everything is trained in this one master model that is
yeah,
stored on, like, say, OpenAI servers or whomever model you're using. And then, like, through the internet, we're grabbing that from that mainframe. And some people are running the local ones that, but they may be a little smaller. But I think maybe there will be a new revolution of the PC for these AI models or something like that, where, like, maybe one day we will have the same power that OpenAI currently has, or like Facebook has in these data centers, in our pockets,
yeah,
30 years from now or something, where it's
right.
like right now we see that
These,
as
like, there
just
was that company
abstract,
that
but
tried to make these wearables, and
yeah, like, was that the Humane Pin
yeah,
or Rabbit or
but
something
but it
like
felt
that?
like, yeah, exactly, yeah, those, and but it felt like they were trying to solve a problem, or they had an answer to, they didn't know
Hmm.
what the problem, the question
Yeah,
was, right?
exactly. Yeah, that's right. I think those were just poor company, poor execution,
Yeah,
or so. But maybe in that direction,
yeah,
though, or so. Because I do wonder if, like, is there one day going to be a device that we do have that can just monitor you, and it is private because it's the thing in your pocket, or it's the chip in your brain, or whatever, that, can, it has more compute than we could possibly imagine right now. So don't they say too, like, we have more compute in your iPhone than NASA had to go to the moon or
oh
so
yeah,
too, and
definitely,
that only took 60 years or so. So it's like 60 years from now, I wonder if we look at these like giant data centers that we're building with 100,000 H100s and all, and that's
right,
just like what you get a 10-year-old for their birthday or
yeah,
something.
yeah,
That's
right,
just like
right,
normal, in
yeah.
private, and personal too, where you don't need to tie back to have some company like maintain all that data or so, and all your queries aren't going to them.
Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, the future is now, but at the same time, I think it starts to again make us sort of question, well, which way is progress really is.
What do you
You
mean
know what
by
I
that?
mean?
No, I don't.
Well, okay, let me back up then. I mean, for instance, a wearable that can, maybe sync up with your phone or something, right? And ask yourself, is that something that people want? And then ask yourself, is that something that's ethically responsible, right? For instance, if it's keeping track of where we're at, and location, right? For instance, technology is fallible. I'm always aware of that. Let's say, the 23andMe or whatever, that company that where you could test your
Right. Your
your
DNA.
ancestry, and
Hmm.
and then suddenly all that data was stored and now is being auctioned off to a company because it went bankrupt, right? So, this idea of, was that really progress or not, right? Like, it's maybe if it's one step backwards or forwards, but it's three steps backwards later, or ethically really playing fast and loose with, I think, rules and social norms and privacy expectations. then again, I think that's something that we really need to be discussing as a society, right? I mean, we have all of these tools now coming online, but what we really don't have is anybody sort of looking at the future, going, well, where do we really want to go, right? I mean, our federal government's completely reactive to things. I mean, they just sort of react to things.
Hmm.
They're not really being that proactive, right? It's
Right.
not like we have somebody that
That's
says,
true.
you know,
And also
like
then,
maybe,
or it is the tech bros. And are they really the ones? They're not our saviors, they are not like they're not
well,
all
do they have our best
powerful and
interests in mind,
right,
right?
even yeah, sure.
And are our best interests aligned with their shareholders' best
Well, that's a good
interests,
one. Yeah, exactly. In
right?
the case like Meta or so,
Or their
yeah,
angel
like
investors' best interests?
Zuckerberg has a law, isn't it? Like, doesn't it by law he is required to provide for the shareholders or so, or something like that, where it's
Yeah,
like,
he probably has some sort of fiduciary
yeah,
responsibility
yeah,
to
that's the
towards
phrase. That's
those
right. Hmm.
constituents of his, yeah, that basically invests money.
And so it's like, well, then of course we know what he's aligned to because that's literally his job.
Yeah, yeah,
That's like
right.
it's built into that or so.
And look, I have no
Mhm,
background in law or any or
mhm,
finance or anything, right? So, but I mean, I think everybody can sort of see some of these more obvious problems right now and then also coming up on the horizon. We really
mhm.
need as a society to be thinking about these things, talking about them. And ultimately we need our public policy makers and our the folks who have all the capital to really be, I think, trying to come up with um, ways to deal with them that are optimal for society and not just for short-term shareholder value.
Are you
Right?
familiar with the All In podcast and
No,
those guys? It's a tech podcast with some
no.
tech bros on it. Some
Oh, I
billionaire
think
tech
I've heard of
bros
this. I think
are
I've
on
heard of
it,
this.
and they did a conference recently. And I was just listening to because our president spoke in that conference, and it was an AI conference. And
Yeah,
who also spoke there was like Jensen from
yeah.
NVIDIA.
NVIDIA.
AMD has, is it Susan? Maybe I apologize, I don't remember her name,
Yeah.
but like CEO of AMD was there, NVIDIA, OpenAI, like
The hardware and the
big
model
players in this
folks.
giant
Yeah.
AI conference. And our president is speaking, and he's talking about like copyright, and he's like, we need to get rid of it. Copyright. How can these AI companies, if we're going to be moving this AI world, like it's just getting in the way. And like they're not going to pay artists every single time they're like, referencing their sources and all. And I'm just like, wait a minute, like what's going on here? Like, excuse
Right.
me, you have all the tech people in the room that you're aligned with. You're the most powerful person here and like head lawmaker. And you're just like, we need to get rid of copyright. And it's like, is
It's an
there nobody
enormous
else?
transfer of value.
Yeah. And there's nobody else in the room here that's like, like raise your hand. Can we talk about that?
Right.
Like, is there a conversation here? Like, we're just gonna go full force and we're just gonna do that because they say so. And like, there's no
Yeah. No,
like, there's
that's
never been a philosophical conversation around this. Like, the
yeah.
community isn't engaged in this conversation, And then the
I mean,
artists that created that copyright content,
sure.
they don't get a say. Like, why
Yeah.
isn't
I
Disney
mean,
there?
again, I think your bigger question is this really progress?
Yeah, well, right.
I don't think so, right? And
Mhm. Or
and,
at
and the
what
fact that
cost?
that
It's
that
like,
they
oh my
don't have to
gosh.
get any kind of licensing agreements and pay for some of these things or to have access to these things or to be able to use these things, absolutely, right? I mean, I think that's again. Now, I would argue that categorically dismissing these technologies, like I see some creatives do,
Right.
is
Yeah.
is is folly, is fool's play.
Because
But at the
technology will
same time,
progress too.
again, I think we need to have a seat at the table.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Hmm. Hmm.
so, we need to know how these things work, and we need to, again, figure out again. But to me, I think this is part of a larger thing. I mean, I think economically, politically, I mean, I think, this goes back and forth, right, depending on which side of the coin you're on. But 50% of it feels like, at any given time, 50% of our country feels like nothing's working for them.
Right.
You know,
Hmm.
economics, politics, technology, whatever you want to, whatever category it is. And so, I think I would argue, at this point in time, we can either be a little more proactive in trying to figure out how we make things work better for everybody, or I don't know what the alternative is, but
Right.
things get worse and worse until
I mean, even there, it's
they
like
break.
back to the AGI and all. It's like, yeah, we haven't even figured out over the course of human civilization politics.
Yeah.
So now when AI is, I almost wonder if the super intelligent AI, it's kind of like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it said that the answer to everything is 42, and I almost wonder if the answer is the AI is just going to spit back to us like, you figure it out. That's on you to figure out. Maybe that's part of
Sure.
it. Maybe that's what consciousness is you figure it out.
Well, I mean, what's interesting, and Sam Altman, I think, was just talking about this. I heard a conversation he was having, and in public, and this that even if there was a super intelligent AI, like I think they said something like a ChatGPT 7.0,
Right.
and you could just basically tell the president what to do, make all the decisions, or how to run OpenAI and become the new CEO of OpenAI and make all the decisions. Would it work? Would you want that? Would you do it?
Mhm.
Would the decisions from a decision-making tree that can see much further out than our brains, maybe it's right, but would we even understand why it's right, or what the decisions even mean, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
so, again, it boils down to, there are other forms of intelligence than human intelligence. If we make one that we don't necessarily understand, do
Mhm.
we care?
Mhm.
And does it care about us, right?
I mean,
Um,
yeah, a
and,
natural
and the other
mhm.
thing to think about, again, this is down the road, right? But if we did have this existential problem of putting a vast, superior intelligence, non-biological intelligence in charge of things, right? Could we be collateral damage when it's trying to solve problems, but doesn't really necessarily care about our existence,
Well,
right?
then what it's going to do is use us as a battery. It's going to build a simulation and put
Yeah.
us in there. That's a
Strap us all in, and we either take the blue pill or the red
Yeah,
pill, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah, that's what it'll all end to. Yeah.
But
But
I mean, it's
that's a
fascinating,
deep
right?
philosophy of a
On one
movie
hand, we
too.
have R2D2 that we grew up with, and on the other
Right.
hand, we have HAL 3000 that we grew up with,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, but I love R2D2. Yeah. Or
Right?
C3PO might be my favorite robot.
Right?
It's like a paranoid robot. I love that idea.
They're
Uh,
always welcome at my cantina, right? And so,
yeah, yeah,
to me, I
exactly.
think that's the thing, right? Like, people go, "Oh, AI is evil," and it's like, well, what if it did actually develop feelings, right? What if it did
Mhm,
develop a consciousness? What if it was actually somehow superior in intelligence in a certain way, right?
mhm,
I'm not ready to. I mean, us humans, we used to think that the world revolved around us, right?
mhm.
Pre-Copernican times,
That's
right?
right. Yeah,
And
that's
now we
right.
call those years the Dark Ages, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, to me,
Mhm,
I think I'm not willing to just sort of say like, art can only be made by humans and in
mhm,
this sort of stuff.
mhm,
I'm more
mhm.
open-minded, or at least I'd
Right.
like to think that I am.
Well, I would also argue that, and hey, personally, the most beautiful things I've ever seen came from nature.
Yeah.
And what intelligence was that? It's like go to a national park in the US and, go to the Grand Canyon and stare at it. That to
Yeah.
me is way more beautiful than the Met Museum or something. Like, I've never been driven to so much awe or been drawn to tears like I have in nature. Or so too. And I would even say the same
Sure.
thing about people, like um, people, other humans, which came from nature. It's like th- those are some of the most beautiful things too,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah. Of
it's like,
course.
so yeah, I mean, when you say different forms of intelligence, I mean, we don't even think that nature is built by intelligence, but
Right.
then how is it the most beautiful thing? And how does it
Yeah.
also work? And ecosystems work. We can ruin them. And that's even the thing. We say we ruin them, but we say we're intelligent. So then,
Yeah.
oh, gee, that I'm getting lost again. Yeah, help me.
No, right. I mean, again, this is where, again, critical thinking, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think human brains like to grasp with. right? We like to ask ourselves these things. We know that we need to have these debates, right? Sometimes inside our own heads on what's
Yeah.
right or wrong, or
Hmm.
what is truth, even, right? So, these things are, I think, really interesting. But here's the thing, right? One way to think about this is that, we are, maybe we're spiritual beings, or that we have a consciousness, and another way of thinking about it is sort of more maybe neo-materialist way of thinking about it is that, our brains are just simply machines that have particular sort of biological connections and synapses and it's the electricity flowing through us, just the connections become a sort of metaphor for how to potentially structure non-biological machines that could become intelligent. So, again, I don't, I'm an architect and a designer. I don't know anything about biology. I don't know
Right.
anything about genetics.
Hmm.
I really don't, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not a scientist at all. I haven't been trained as a scientist. I've been trained as a designer, right? And so, to me, I think these are questions. But, I think some of these, here's, I don't know how much time we have left. I can talk
Hey,
forever.
I'm
But
I'm
one of the things I
actually
might say
available
is,
today, so
one of the things I
if you have
might say
time.
is right now we're sort of trying to answer all these questions as if they're scientific questions with a scientific answer
Mm.
or an engineering answer. And I think what we really need to do is sort of acknowledge some of these are philosophical questions that we need to grasp with as a society. And then they aren't necessarily scientific questions, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So a scientific question might be, is this possible? And a philosophical question is, maybe instead of saying
Is it
is
right?
it progress, should we do this,
Right. Yeah.
right? Not
Hmm.
can we do it, but should we
Right.
do it,
Sure. I mean, you
right?
could say the same thing about like the atomic bomb, maybe.
Yeah,
We
exactly,
have the
exactly. All of
technology.
these
We can.
technologies can be
Hmm.
used for good or bad, or right or
Right.
wrong.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things to sort of again talk about right now, we're talking about, we say AI, but we're really talking about these models trained through machine learning techniques. And they're very narrow. They do some certain things really well in a very narrow sense, right? And I think, we talked about that bigger is better. Maybe you just pump more and more information to these models, and suddenly they sort of infer intelligence. I don't think I don't think that's the way it's going to work. I think that maybe large language models might be a piece to a larger puzzle, right? But I think even these large language models, we're not quite sure how they work when they're working, right? Like
Right.
they're kind of a black box still. So they're
Hmm.
like they're a really good computer scientist and roboticist from UC Berkeley. I was hearing him talk about these things, and he sort of said large language models and diffusion models, they're an engineering feat, but without the sort of scientific knowledge and underpinning, so that we really understand what's going on and where these things fit into the larger puzzle. And so it's kind of like we've opened Pandora's box, but we still have a long ways to go before we really sort of understand, I think,
Or will we
um,
ever? Because if it is
how
super
to make decisions.
intelligent
Yes.
and we're just mere conscious humans, maybe we literally can't figure it out. Maybe that, because if we could figure it out, we would all be super intelligent as well. It's
Yeah.
like, uh,
Yeah.
but I don't know. Yeah, beats me on that. And I also like that idea of the agents thing. I'm kind of coming around to that too, where it's like maybe there shouldn't be a central master model. Maybe you do need to like specialize in smaller
Look,
models or
everybody
so.
does things differently. They think differently. They work differently.
Mhm.
Maybe a one size fits all is really kind of the dumb way of doing it, right? Now, look, it it creates some innovation, and but look at what they're doing. They're using the low hanging fruit. They're using the training data that's just immediately available to them, that there's lots of, like all
Right,
of the written words on the internet or all of the images on the internet,
right,
right? And at the same time, making them accessible so that they're on your smartphone. They're everywhere. They're ubiquitous, right? Anybody can use them. They're commercially available, and they're things that capture people's imagination anyway. But the question is, how do we go beyond flashy imagery or just an essay writing machine to do again, how do we push these things and in what ways would we want to, right? I think that's a question that we still need to sort of answer, right? How do we move beyond just flashy imagery that helps us some of the good storytellers to tell good stories still, right? Or
Hmm.
whatever it is.
Hmm.
So, to me, I think that's really interesting because if we can start to leverage computation, I think in ways that help us deal with some of the more existential problems that we have, whereas the 20th century was making a lot of decisions and innovations, but not necessarily understanding the longer term ramifications of our decisions, right? So now suddenly we're modifying the climate faster than we could possibly ever evolve. We pollute, we filling up our landfills, and all this sort of stuff, and our cities grow outwards instead of upwards, and all of these sorts of things. We have obesity, and lots of problems that we've left future generations with. The question is, can superintelligence actually help us better understand the problems and how we might actually unwind them, or make decisions, but actually understand how they might play out in the future, and therefore let us make some decisions where we start to understand some of the longer term ramifications, not just in the short term.
Well, so in that sense, the AI is just a tool, and it might be a very good tool. But I would make the argument we already have the tools today to solve all those issues, but we
Probably
don't.
do, right?
But
And we
why aren't
just
we?
reformat it so it appears like an oracle where we ask a question and it spits something back at us or
Mhm.
something.
So even if we had the tool, would we use it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right. That's a good
It's like
point.
that's something we.
And look, that I think gets to a critical way of sort of thinking about these things, right? At a certain point, you kind of wonder, well, and again, this is the centralization model. What good are governments if they're just going to roll over and say copyright doesn't exist, or
Hmm.
you can put data centers wherever you want,
Hmm.
use up the water here,
Hmm.
pollute over here,
Hmm.
create 24/7 noise over in this neighborhood or whatever. Who's really running things,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And at the
Exactly.
same time, what we really need is some level-headed policy making,
Hmm.
that can respond and be a little more nimble,
Right.
and not paralyzed by, again, short-term politics and we're really seem to be hamstrung with these days. So
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
easy to say, it's harder to actually
Hmm.
pull off. But
Yeah, I in that one, I'm like you. I'm just an architect. Yeah, I
yeah,
don't know. These things are beyond me as well. And also, I don't even want to deal with some of those issues. It's like,
yeah,
I feel grateful that there are people that step up to the plate to, try to play in those arenas to solve some of these problems
right.
because,
And look, but then
yeah.
as an architect, design, the sort of built environment, I talk to lots of architects and architecture firms, landscape architects, planners, interior designers, folks like that, and in the allied fields, in this part of the building industry. And ultimately, I think the question that we have is, how does this help us make better buildings or better communities, better cities, whatever it is, right? And I think, again, the jury's still out on whether we have any of those tools available to us at the moment. There's some coming online and some that are being integrated into tools that we have through Autodesk or whatever. But at the same time, again, it's sort of, we don't have a lot of these niche tools to help us.
Hmm.
And so a lot of their questions, when I talk to a firm, they're like, well, like, are we doing this right? Like, are we reading this right? Like, does it just make pictures? And it's
Hmm.
kind of like, well, don't worry. First of all, everybody's asking the same questions you are,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And sort of navigating a space that we've never been before.
Right.
And there's a very fast moving space where things change very
I mean,
quickly.
although there is an argument to be made on on say Midjourney and those diffusion models is, and correct me where I'm wrong here on the
Yeah.
science behind it, but as far as I know, they're just predicting the pixel next to the current pixel that matches the training data
Yeah, that's one way of
as
putting it, right? So they basically generalize all they do as a set of patterns, and those patterns are written as these sort of chains of of characters, right? And so really that's it. They're sort of
But
predicting
it's an
pixels.
RGB
So
value.
they predict pixels that are ordered from pixels that are less ordered, right? So what how they work, how they're trained is they take ordered pixels and they then again destroy and degrade to noise. And then when you reverse that process, then suddenly you go from disorder to order in different patterns
Mm-hmm.
based off of those tokens, basically all those words and characters that were attached to the sort of things that could be seen in the image, green grass or cloudy
Right.
skies
Right.
or trees with leaves and
Right.
things like that.
But then even, using that phrase patterns, it's not picking up on like, or maybe it can learn that, but it's not picking up on actual architectural patterns, say, it's like, because it, or does it, or does it go beyond predicting? Because to me, it's like when I just think about it as a pixel predictor, it's like, well, it knows that you change the RGB value on the pixel one over, and that, according to the machine, that's just like, that's all it knows. But it ends up when we look at it, looking like a space you can maybe walk through, but it has no understanding that that is a space that you can walk through and what that means,
Right,
right? Or or,
right.
or could it learn
Yeah.
that?
So I mean, for instance, it can generate these just incredible atmospherics with volumetric light rays coming through a window and piercing through a dark space. That's very moody and almost looks like sort of monumental but very solemn. And it has no clue what light really is. It
Yeah,
does
right.
has no
Okay.
clue what a heavy masonry brick is. Even though it might know that, you might be referring to it in grids or stacked or heavy or thick or, whatever, masonry, can be given
And it's
quality
really only
wise. So,
knowing those patterns because the tags that were applied to the image that went into the training data had that tag applied to it.
right,
Or so,
right.
right?
So there's really good algorithms called where you can feed it images. The machine reads the image, starts to even generate all that
Okay.
metadata, right?
Like a
It's called clip.
self-labeler or
It's
something.
called clip, and then
Okay.
you can reverse that, and so suddenly you can write prompts in natural language, and it takes looks at all those words as tokens, finds them in its latent space, and then starts to use those patterns. And
Hmm.
again, it's a very naive way of sort of making images, right?
Hmm.
Again, it can generate, perfect wood grain, but doesn't know what that feels like, doesn't know what it
Hmm.
smells like, doesn't know that it came from a tree, doesn't know that it, whatever. And so again, it's a very sort of naive
Right.
system,
That's
right?
right.
And I think what's really interesting to me is sort of seeing some of those naive combinations, the uncanny juxtapositions that it does, and sort of saying, well, of course, it's going to have a very limited understanding of our world
Hmm.
if it only understands from the images fed in its training data and the descriptors attached to those images, right?
Hmm.
Or
Hmm.
videos, all of let's say the videos that you can feed it from systems like YouTube and Vimeo and etc. Right? So, these sorts of models. Again, the idea was that if you feed it more and more data, it starts to understand our world better.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it really does feel like they're really just sort of token generators, um, and not necessarily anything with a real
Right. And
with a
that's,
real conscience
I guess
or
that's why also the images are always beautiful. Like even if
yeah.
if you look at it even more from a distance too, it has correct composition, it has correct color, it has correct contrast. It's like I've never seen an AI
And
image overexposed.
that's all about its training data and then how you weight
Right.
how you give it weights to sort of understand how it makes connections in its model. It's sort of if you think about it as a set of nodes that are then interconnected with other nodes,
Hmm.
and so it's again it's like Mid-Journey is weighted in a particular way so that it really does seem to pick up on all of those compositional and color theory cues that it learned from a long tradition of, let's say, Western art, right?
Sure.
To the point that it's very biased in that sense. If you just type in gibberish,
Mm.
oftentimes you'll get a white woman's face or,
Wow.
bust, sort of, um, because of just that, if it reverts to the mean, that's sort of been the mean of Western art. And so again, it's sort of is a really interesting thing to begin to pick up on. Is again, you can call it bias. You can call it sometimes when things get a little too good and really predictable, and there's lack of predictability or lack of creativity. We call that overfitting, right? In other words, it's going to give us exactly what it's seen in its training data. And when in fact I kind of value sort of having it do things that I wouldn't necessarily think of, right? And so, again, how these things work and how you want them to be useful for your own work is, I think, still an open question. But some folks to find these things really useful, they want to get exactly what they have in their head.
Right.
You'll be sorely disappointed with these models if you're trying to do that because if it gives you exactly what you were thinking, it's a real fluke. Very few and far between.
You got
When that
lucky, you're
happens,
saying.
you're going to be very frustrated. They don't think like us, and I think that's one of the interesting things about these models. And trying to sort of think about how they can be used creatively is how is their generative capacity valuable? Um, so anyway,
And that even like and we briefly touched on this in the beginning of like even control nets, which that's us trying to like get a little bit more of a wrangle on it. But to me, even
right,
control nets, it's like, well, what are the basic inputs? It's like outlines, a depth map, or I've
yeah,
seen like rigs,
yeah.
maybe you can do, but even those to me, it's like that's so
And then
like
it's like then you,
elementary.
you start to describe with natural language. Then you can add
Hmm.
style references.
Hmm.
You can give it images and say, look, this is kind of, the same mood or the same sky, or here's what I'm talking about when I say textured concrete or whatever,
Right.
right? So yeah, I mean, and again, it's all about trying to get more and more control.
Right.
Um,
Hmm. Hmm. But
but
it's also back to the pixel to me too,
yeah,
because like for instance, an outline, if you have a black image, white outline, all it's reading there is the pixels. It still doesn't have this understanding of like what that object is.
yeah.
It's just matching that pixel. So then when it's running, it's
And here's the
like
real thing, like if I'm really trying to generate some geometry, like that I can call walls and floors and roofs and things like that, window wall and solid, big, thick cast things and
right.
puts openings in. The way AI might help me is if I need to do something complex and it can help me write a plugin or do
Yeah.
some end
Yeah.
user
Yeah. Right.
scripting
Hmm. Hmm.
that might be beyond my very limited skills and writing some Python or something like that, right? And so, in that case, I think that's a really interesting way to think about how these large language models can augment design.
Hmm.
Is suddenly I don't have to learn the really foreign language of Python or C sharp
Right.
or JavaScript or
Hmm.
whatever it is.
Hmm.
But suddenly I can start to, if I can think computationally, I
Hmm.
can I can begin to write out that sort of pseudocode in natural language, and then let ChatGPT or Claude or one of those other language, Gemini, try to script it out for me in the language that I need it to, and go back and forth, right? That sort of vibe coding idea. Because when I
Exactly.
first did that in 2022, that just seemed like magic, right?
Yeah. Oh
Now
yeah.
there's even a word for it. Now it's vibe coding,
Yeah.
and
Vibe
everybody,
coding.
yeah, vibe coding, right? I'll
Exactly.
just make the next killer app. I just got to get a good idea.
Uh
But when
huh.
I do, ChatGPT will write it for me, right? And then, of course, there's all kinds of problems with that, of course. You know, I mean, it's one thing to sort of write an end user script when you're using it locally in your machine, but trying to write the next killer app that actually collects data from people's phones and
Hmm.
things
Hmm.
like that, you can't have security exploits. And
Well, you heard of like the T app this week.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. That was
Great
this is the
example.
dating app thing that just got
Yeah.
hacked, right?
Hmm. Exactly.
Yeah,
Hmm.
no, absolutely. I mean, that's a
And those were
disaster for
like
the
driver's
users, right?
licenses, which
Yeah,
is like,
user data. I
mhm,
mean,
right.
when you give up that kind of data, that's probably the maybe one of the few times people actually read the fine print and some of those
Hmm.
user agreements you're
Right.
you're doing. So you have I think people go into that having a reasonable expectation of privacy
Well,
or
because
security for their
in the
data.
past, it was done by professionals that did
Yeah,
understand those terms. And so then
right.
when you do enter in this like new group of really amateurs that can
Oof.
appear as professionals because
Right.
of that AI
Right.
tool, but really they don't know what they're doing. It's like, what you found this little like blip where it just doesn't
Yeah.
connect properly, and that even kind of reminds me what you were even saying earlier of like, like we have the tools, but should you use it, kind of a thing
Yeah.
too, because like that
Yeah.
the
So I
the
mean, to
founder
me, I
of
think
that
that's
app
that's a
had the
critical
tool,
thing, right?
but
That
shouldn't have
gets to
used
the
it.
ethics of this,
Yeah.
right? At a certain point, right? Here's why I'm not worried about an architect, about AI replacing me. Because I can't imagine a company that wants to take on the liability
Yeah.
of every single building project in
Mhm.
making sure everything works and all the details are correct and
Mhm.
structurally it's sound, right? So that doesn't necessarily replace expertise. And I think that's where, again, tech bros get a little ahead of themselves. I think they need to approach this with a little more humility
Right.
when they're
Mhm.
talking about or promising some of the things that their models do. Because I
Yeah.
think people
Mhm.
start to get resentful of these sort of over promises and at the same time saying, well, no, we just need to make the next model and invest literally all of our resources into this,
Right.
right? We can't invest everything
Mhm.
into these things. We still have to function as a society and
Mhm.
eat and have electricity and fresh water, potable water. So,
Sure.
these sorts of things aren't negotiable, right?
Mhm.
And yet I think some of these tech bros, they come across as if they have the control and if they had their way, then we would be like the little anthill that they could step on in the process of making progress, right?
Mhm.
So, to me, I guess that's the question, right? Is there, can we get back to the sort of humanistic ideas of, again, asking ourselves the questions, which way progress really is?
Well, it's funny that you're asking the question, are we going to get to a humanistic idea? Um, and you're going to ask that to the AI people,
Yeah.
who
Well,
in their
no, I
name,
mean,
it's artificial
th-
intelligence.
look,
It's not
it, it,
human-centered
if we
intelligence.
start to make machines that can make and program more machines,
Mhm.
then shouldn't we be studying ethics and the sort of
Mhm.
tradition of trying to understand, like, well, how do we continue a functioning society?
Right.
I
Mhm.
mean, because I mean they act like we get to that chicken and egg problem where it's like, well, if you've won capitalism, technically you have all the money and then you'd have no customers.
Right.
You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
So, this idea of if you've won everything, so what, right? Like at a certain point, how is it fun?
Mhm, mhm. It's even like, speaking I mean, I play this video game Valheim. Have you heard of that by chance?
No, no,
It's a
no.
PC game. I don't
Yeah.
game much, but Valheim gets me hooked. It's kind of like I would just the best way to describe it is, man, what's the game with the blocks that kids play? Minecraft. It's like
Yeah.
Minecraft, but less total voxel. It actually uses
Oh,
pixels
okay.
or so. But
Uh-huh.
it's like you're in a forest, you first punch a tree and get some wood. Then with the wood, you can build an axe. Then you can chop down the
Right.
tree, go collect
Right.
stone. And what I like about it as an architect is they have a really good building mechanic system in there. And
Interesting.
so I really enjoy building, but I've entered God mode before in that game because, it's kind of like you're playing The Sims and you do Rosebud, for infinite money. It's just like I now have all of the resources and I can build anything I want. And the problem I always hit when I do that is I don't know what to build because there's no
Yeah.
meaning anymore. Because regular Valheim, what you're building is you're building a structure to keep the monsters out at night. You need the flame to keep going so you could feed yourself. Well, you need to go find
Right.
food. To get the food, you need a special equipment for that, but you need a storage place for that in your home or whatnot. So it's like what you're actually building there is usefulness or so, or like,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm designing for when you're playing Valheim. So when you have infinite money and you have, you know, when you're in God mode, the meaning's gone and the game becomes no fun because there's nothing to build. There's no meaning to build anything.
Yeah. I that to me, I think is really interesting because um it gets back to I think what we were just talking about, right? I mean, again, at this point, it's not just like, well, what can we make or like how do we make these models, but how are we going to use them, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like the creatives are the ones that usually figure these things out first.
Hmm.
right? They're not the ones that make the technologies. They're the ones that figure out how to use them or how to break them, how to make them do things that they weren't even intended to do, right? And so, to me, I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle that's been missing from this sort of discourse,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Well, I feel like
And
that's
in
a role
fact, in
you've picked
fact,
up.
we've driven them away when you sort of use all of their intellectual property against their will or without them knowing, and then they didn't even have any skin in the game then, right? So,
Hmm.
again, I think these are real issues, and I think again. I don't think that the tech bros or the folks in charge are have any incentive to try to fix any of it. So, and I think in this case, we really do need more nimble policy making. But again, here's the thing about policy making. If you make the wrong ones, then you start to skew things in other ways, right? That could be again potentially destructive or certainly could slow down, create another sort of AI winter where you don't have much innovation again for another 10 or 12 years before something else sort of emerges. So yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, again, all of the technologies have these ways of sort of making us sort of reevaluate and ask questions about us, right? That's um, and we do it in our own various ways, right? Film and playwrights, they sort of, they start to think in terms of science fiction, maybe to sort of again bring some of these questions to light and make them accessible to us. These sort of ethical questions or dilemmas, these or in science and in medicine, we start to learn things. We study ourselves in order to understand the world better, right? And the world that we want to build better. So, it's here's an interesting thing, right? What if instead of us doing the research, if AI could start doing its own research, right? That's where I think we could actually start to see something begin to accelerate into some sort of general intelligence, right? If
Hmm.
it can do research better than humans, um, then certainly I think that's again an inflection point where progress or innovation accelerates even more.
Hmm.
Right?
That I feel like when I just think of that, about that future, people will then become numb to that. And every day is a new breakthrough. And it becomes to the point where people are
What do
just
we
sick
do
of
if what do
breakthroughs,
we do in a world where we don't have labor,
Yeah.
human labor, right?
Yeah, that one, I don't know,
And,
especially
and
because,
not only what do
and
we do, but
mhm,
if we are, say, a leisure society,
mhm.
will us humans inevitably be unsatisfied with that?
I would be
Or can we
unsatisfied.
still be
Mhm.
satisfied with that? Um,
I actually enjoy working, because,
yeah,
and
well,
that's maybe why I'm an architect. It's like, I like building
yeah,
things, maybe not working. I enjoy creating things.
yeah,
And so a leisure society to me is like, I'm not just going to sit there on the chair all day because then I'm not building anything,
right,
So it's
right.
like,
Yeah,
if it wants me to provide me the opportunity to build more things, that's great. But then I also think, well, a lot of times my limitation of building things is materials. It's like, if I had an endless quarry, an endless lumber, then you can build lots of things, you know.
right.
But even an idea where, I guess if machines are doing that too, I don't, is that what you're saying? Like robots, even like beyond AI, even like AI
Yeah, like
robots that are
what if
doing
we
things.
became a
Mhm.
leisure society where we're just
Mhm.
pampered,
Right.
we're taken
Mhm.
care of? What would we do? And would we
Mhm.
find fulfillment in it?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
Do we
Mhm.
need
Mhm. No,
do
I
we
think
need
we're
to
going to have
have
that same God problem I have in Valheim.
yeah,
I think we're going to
exactly, right?
realize that without a struggle, without a purpose, without something to do, and with having a struggle, there's no point to the game. Like,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
game is survival,
Right,
maybe,
right.
or
Like
something.
you need objectives. You
Right.
need to
Mhm.
have some problems to solve or wrestle with.
Yeah, that's right.
You
Mhm.
need some objectives to sort of,
Mhm.
figure
Mhm.
out,
Right. Well,
right?
even when we
And to
say, like, we
and there's
say
something satisfying about setting goals and attaining them,
in
right?
we call it gamifying.
Yeah.
How do you attract more users to your app or something? Oh, you
Yeah.
gamify it. Well,
Yeah.
what does that
Gamify
mean?
it.
Is you set these bars that they have to reach, these levels that they have to get to. They have to work towards it. Then you
Right.
get it, then you get a
Right.
reward. And then we
There's
set
a
new
set of,
bars, get it,
and
reward.
inevitably, as part of gamification, there's that also, that's the component of dude, I just lost my train of thought, of competing, competition.
Oh, sure,
You know what I
right.
mean? So
Oh
you know,
yeah.
like the Fitbit, right? Like it wasn't enough just to get like 10,000 steps,
Yeah, that's
but can
right.
I get more steps this week than, the schmuck that lives down the street from me,
Yeah,
or
that's
something
right.
like that, because or whatever. So, this idea of competition, making it a game, is
And I would
very
say
much
those
appealing.
things are actually built into us, where you're
Yeah.
born with that is like, to me, because also sometimes I think even with AI, where everything is trained, it's like, well, like, isn't it when a horse is born, the horse knows how to walk? There was no like training in there. The horse didn't need to observe other horses walking. It didn't need like that's somehow just
Right.
built into its
Right. The
DNA or
instinct.
something. It just comes with it. Or I don't,
Yeah.
there, I'm not a biologist, say I don't know exactly how that works, but to me, it's like something to do with the DNA or the genes or something. It's just like this embedded thing. And I wonder if some things like competition or some things like the urge to have challenge reward systems
Yeah.
are just built into us. And then there,
It does
I
feel like
guess,
there's some sort of instinctual need
mhm.
for these things.
But then it's
Yeah.
like, is that something then for an AI? Will it ever even learn that? Or maybe it would. Could you train it for that? Because then maybe the AI won't be super competitive because that's not really something that we learn. That's just something that
Again,
is
I
in
mean,
us.
imagine taking a history class or humanities class or an art class, but it's pivoted to sort of thinking about not just learning certain skills, but sort of thinking critically about, well, what do us humans do, and what do machines do, and
Mm-hmm.
so we start to have these conversations. Again, I think the universities are a very rare example of a place in the universe that could actually be helpful in sort of having the tools to help with these conversations. I don't see it happening just because, again, we're complacent, and large institutions that move at a glacial pace. We aren't good at pivoting.
I see.
But at the same time, I think that here's what I see eventually happening, right? The nature of labor shifts, and I think a skills-based education and work training gets devalued,
Hmm.
and sort of cultivating critical thinking skills, being able to sort of again be the sort of orchestrator of processes, is I think more important. And so being able to make decisions, being able to weigh decisions, being able to scaffold a process and then direct machines or others to sort of to execute, I think is really going to be um, the sort of value proposition in the future. And look, I struggle with this all the time. I'm trying to teach the next generation of professionals in architecture. And I struggle with this a lot. Like, how much do we teach as just running to the soccer ball, and how much do we teach running to where the soccer ball is going to be, right? Or where it's going. And so, I think we have to do a little bit of both, but I mean, at a certain point, if I can tell my computer in natural language what to do, right? Then I think the question is, now that it can do anything, what do I tell it? Is
Mm-hmm.
the more important question.
Yeah, it's the
I actually
question,
have to
right?
teach class soon, so
Okay. All right. Well, then
yeah.
we'll get out of
If
here.
there's
Well, yeah.
any good sort of stopping point,
Hey, sorry. And
but what a great
I get
conversation. It's
lost in it
gone
too.
longer than I
Yeah.
ever thought it would.
And then, I guess just last thing on that, maybe this is a
Yeah,
great way to end too. I haven't really been to university since I guess like just a few years after I last saw you. Been a while, been a
yeah,
decade, say. You're way more embedded into that than I am. But to me, and even seeing what you've done with AI and how you're using it, I still think it's in the university because I came to you, for
yeah.
instance, to even talk to today on this because you are, I would say, out of everyone that I know, the most knowledgeable one on this. And so I still, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to give the university more credit, and just saying like, it does take people like you too at universities to be doing these things. And I think you are on top of it, especially in AI.
Well, thanks.
So with that too, hey, thanks for chatting with me today and
Yeah,
kind of bringing me up to
absolutely.
speed on this because, I also haven't had conversations like this since university. And so it
My
feels really
pleasure.
good.
Anytime. I'd be curious to sort of see what we would talk about like in a year's time
Yeah. Hey,
and to see what's changed and what
yeah.
hasn't, right? I mean,
That's right. Yeah, same. I would love to do that. Hopefully, this podcast carries on. It's brand new. I don't even know what I'm doing with it. And I was actually just telling a friend last night, like, I
sure.
think this is a therapy for me because I'm also in this transition too with AI and architecture, just even in my
Yeah,
career now into my 30s and how
yeah,
I'm approaching that. And I kind of like this idea of bringing on everyone that I know, the smartest people I know, I want to talk to publicly and try to just figure things out in the public, you
yeah,
know. And also,
yeah.
so thanks, Josh. I,
No,
I
this
really
is exactly
appreciate
what
it.
we should be doing, talking about things. It shouldn't be taboo.
Right. Yeah,
We
sure.
should be talking about these things and wrestling with some really, look, there aren't any universal truths, but we should be asking ourselves some of these really important questions as we move forward. Absolutely.
Well, you're a great one to talk to too. I
All
feel like
right.
I'm
Well,
also going to
thank
watch
you.
this like 10 times and just re-listen to what you've said as well and try to digest that even more too.
All
All
right.
right. Well, cheers, man. Good luck at
Yeah,
class.
great talking to you.
All right. See you soon.
See ya.
Bye bye.